Hello, everyone, and welcome back to RealFear Files. Today, I'm bringing you 9 of the most chilling true horror stories hidden deep within the Appalachian wilderness. In this episode, we venture far into the remote backcountry, places where towns vanish, the mountains swallow the light, and the unknown feels painfully close. Together, we'll uncover 9 terrifying accounts involving strange disappearances, haunting cold cases, unsettling crimes, and mysteries that still linger over these isolated mountain communities. Each story has been carefully researched and retold from real reports shared by witnesses, survivors, and those who lived through these unsettling events in complete isolation. These tales rise from forgotten hollows, abandoned roads, and shadowed ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, places where help can be miles away and secrets can remain hidden for generations. To respect the privacy of those involved, some personal information and identifying details have been altered, but the core events remain true to what happened. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to RealFear Files for daily true horror content that will keep you watching your surroundings long after the video ends. And make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss when the darkness creeps in. Now, let's begin our descent into Appalachia's most unsettling stories. And remember, always stay hungry. Story 1. Reed had been talking about this camping trip for months. Anyone who knew him was tired of hearing about it. After grinding through a year of non-stop overtime at his tech job in Raleigh, he felt burnt down to the bolts. The Smokies had always been his reset button, a place where the world quieted down and he could breathe without feeling like someone was standing on his chest. So, when he spotted a post on an outdoor forum about a group heading into a remote corner of Cades Cove, he signed up faster than he probably should have. A couple messages later, he was locked into a 4-day trek through the Appalachian backcountry with 3 people he had never met. The crew was a mixed bag. Reed, a software guy in desperate need of unplugging. Blake, a photographer from Kentucky who talked like he knew every ridge and holler within 100 miles. Jess, a hyper-enthusiastic grad student studying forest ecosystems. And finally Clint, a soft-spoken man from East Tennessee who typed only a few sentences in the group chat, but came across like he'd been doing this sort of thing since childhood. Their plan was simple. Push far past the busy loop road, hike deep into untouched backcountry, and set up camp in a spot Blake claimed to have scouted earlier in the year. A place with no people, no noise, no interruptions. They met at a mostly empty parking area, early on a chilly Thursday morning in late October. Peak tourism season was over, and the usual crowds had thinned to a handful of retirees with cameras aimed at the fading fall colors. They did their awkward hellos, sorted out who carried what, and then followed Blake as he double-checked his GPS and pulled out a crumpled topo map that looked like it had lived in his pack for a decade. The first stretch was easy. Too easy, Reed thought. The trail followed an old settler's route, weaving between collapsed chimneys, moss-eaten fences, and lopsided headstones from families long gone. Jess stopped every few minutes to snap pictures of anything older than she was. 3 hours later, they stepped off the maintained path, and the trail quickly turned into what looked like a forgotten logging road fading back into nature. The woods grew thicker, darker. The air cooled. Even the sunlight felt different, muted, like it couldn't punch through the canopy. Reed noticed how quiet everything was. Too quiet. No bird chatter, no squirrel rustling, not even the usual hum of insects. Their footsteps sounded dull, swallowed by layers of damp leaves. They reached the clearing right as day turned into dusk. It was a tight patch of open ground beside a narrow creek, boxed in on 3 sides by steep ridges choked with mountain laurel. Blake grinned like he'd brought them to paradise, proudly announcing they were at least 8 miles from the nearest marked trail and maybe 15 from the road. "Nobody's gonna bother us out here," he said, sounding way too pleased with himself. Reed's stomach twinged at the comment, but he shoved the feeling down. He wanted isolation. This was isolation. They set up camp in a rough circle around the future fire pit. Clint collected logs, Jess filtered water, and Reed helped Blake sort the cooking gear. By the time the stars were out, they were huddled around a fire, tearing open bags of freeze-dried meals. Blake rambled about remote expeditions he'd done. Jess dove into excited rambles about her research on old-growth forests. Clint hardly spoke at all, staring into the fire like he saw something in the flames nobody else could see. Reed tried to relax, but the dark beyond the firelight felt too deep, too watchful. He kept glancing at the tree line. It was around 10 when the first sound hit them. A long, stretched-out wail drifted from somewhere on the eastern ridge. Jess gave a shaky laugh, saying it was probably a coyote or maybe a bobcat. Blake agreed, but Reed saw his hand drift automatically to the big knife strapped at his hip. Clint didn't say a word. He just squinted toward the ridge like he was trying to see through the dark itself. The cry came again, closer, louder, and this time it didn't sound like an animal at all. More like a woman yelling in agony, but warped, almost metallic, like the sound had scraped across something wrong on its way down the ridge. The hair on Reed's neck stood straight up. They forced themselves to bed eventually, though Reed barely slept. He lay awake listening to the nothingness pressing against the tent. The quiet felt unnatural, heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. When sleep finally took him, it brought nightmares. Trees leaning over him, whispering, something pacing around the tent's perimeter. He jolted awake to Jess calling everyone up, her voice sharp with panic. Reed stumbled out of his tent to find her and Blake standing near the cold fire pit. Clint was gone. His tent stood open, his sleeping bag unzipped, his boots missing. No footprints. No note. Nothing. Blake was already searching the clearing, shouting Clint's name. They all spread out, calling, scanning the underbrush. Down by the creek, Reed noticed something off. The mud was soft, and in it, a single set of boot prints. Clint's. Reed recognized the tread. The prints went straight into the creek and stopped. No prints on the opposite bank, no drag marks, no signs of slipping. Just gone. They searched for hours. Blake tried using his GPS to mark the site, but the device refused to get a signal. Jess pulled out her compass, but the needle spun like it was drunk. Everything electronic was suddenly useless. Finally, they decided Reed should try to hike out for help, while Blake and Jess continued searching. Reed followed what he thought was their route back, until nothing looked familiar. The path forked where he didn't remember a fork. Trees he thought he'd passed before weren't there. His compass whirled just like Jess's had. Panic clawed at him. He kept walking anyway. And that's when he started seeing the carvings. Symbols gouged into tree trunks. Not trail markers. Not anything he'd ever seen before. Circles carved inside other circles. Twisted shapes that made his eyes ache. And still, the suffocating silence pressed in on him from every side. Hours passed before he stumbled upon an old homestead. It rose out of the trees like an apparition. Leaning cabins, broken roofs, wood blackened by age. It wasn't one of the preserved historic sites. This place was ancient, wrong, forgotten. When Reed stepped closer, every instinct screamed at him to stay quiet. The front door of the biggest cabin hung sideways on its hinges, groaning softly as the breeze nudged it. Reed hesitated at the threshold, fighting the tight feeling in his chest, but stepped in anyway. The dim interior smelled like rotten wood layered over something far worse, something cold and metallic, like the chill inside a butcher's freezer. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Old furniture sagged under decades of dust. A collapsed table sat crooked in the center of the room. The floor was littered, not just with debris, but bones. Piles of them. Big bones, tiny bones, bones that looked human, bones that definitely didn't belong to any wildlife he recognized. Cloths were mixed in, scraps faded to colors that barely existed anymore. Shirts? Pants? Something else? He couldn't tell. On every wall, the same symbols he'd seen carved into the trees were etched deep into the logs. Bigger, sharper, more detailed. Reed felt dizzy just looking at them. He backed out of the cabin, heart slamming against his ribs. Every muscle screamed at him to get as far away from this place as he could. And then he saw Clint, or what was left of him. Clint's body dangled from a thick limb on the edge of the clearing, suspended by a rope that looked older than the cabin itself. His skin was a waxy gray. His head hung at an unnatural angle. And his clothes, God, his clothes were the same ones he'd been wearing that morning. But his body looked days dead. Reed froze, breath catching in his throat. He couldn't process it, couldn't make the timeline make sense. Clint had vanished only hours before. Reed had seen him alive at sunrise. Now he looked like something that had been decaying for a week. Reed ran. He didn't look back. Branches sliced at his arms, roots grabbed at his boots. He didn't care. He barreled through the forest like a wild animal trying to escape a trap, lungs burning, legs shaking. When he finally broke through the trees onto the paved road, he practically collapsed onto the asphalt. A passing ranger truck screeched to a stop, the driver jumping out as Reed staggered into view, gasping, trembling, half delirious. Everything after that blurred together. He remembered sitting in the back of the truck, wrapped in a blanket, even though he didn't feel cold. He remembered trying to explain what he'd seen, the cabin, the bones, the symbols, Clint's body. He remembered the look on the ranger's face, a tight, polite expression that said he didn't believe half of it, but also didn't want to spook Reed any further. By the time a full search and rescue team mobilized, Reed's voice was hoarse from retelling the same fragments over and over. When he tried to guide them back into the woods, nothing lined up. The logging road he swore they'd followed wasn't there. The ridge line didn't match his memory. The creek looked different. The forest itself seemed rearranged. The search went on for 3 days. They found the group's tents and the remnants of their campfire. Reed's tent, Blake's tent, Jess's. Clint's gear still neatly stacked inside his open shelter. But Blake and Jess were gone. No footprints, no belongings, no signs of struggle. Just vanished. The search team cataloged every inch of the surrounding forest. No homestead, no collapsing cabins, no bones, no symbols. Nothing Reed described. The only solid finding came 6 months later. A hiker discovered human remains miles away in another section of the park, far from the area Reed had directed rescuers to search. DNA confirmed the remains belonged to Clint. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as exposure, hypothermia. But the file included a note about unexplained marks on the body. Marks that didn't match weather, animals, or any typical hazard. Marks no one could confidently explain without sounding ridiculous. Reed left the mountains immediately after the search ended. He didn't even go home first. He just drove until the Smokies were hours behind him. He sold his camping gear, deleted every hiking app on his phone, blocked the outdoor forum he'd joined, and shoved the whole disaster into the deepest corner of his mind. For a while, he kept it together. He told himself Clint must have wandered off, gotten lost, maybe fallen or panicked. He told himself stress and exhaustion had made his imagination blow things out of proportion. He wanted to believe all of that so badly. But late at night, when everything was quiet, the memories would sneak back in. Jess's panicked voice, Blake's forced confidence, the dead silence of the forest, the wrongness in the air, the twisting symbols carved into the trees. And that sound, that stretched, unnatural wail drifting down the ridge. It still haunted him. Some nights he heard it clearly, like it was echoing inside his skull. Other nights it crept in slowly, like a memory clawing its way out of the dark. Over time, Reed accepted something he didn't dare speak aloud. There are things in the Appalachian backcountry that don't care about park boundaries, trail maps, or search teams. Things that have been there longer than any road, cabin, or ranger station. Things that watch from the tree line with an ancient, patient kind of hunger. Things that do not want to be found. And in the parts of the mountains where the forest swallows sound, where the compasses spin like they're confused, and where the maps might as well be lies, those things are still there. Waiting. Listening. Hungry. Story 2. Before anyone rushes to judge her choices, Lauren wants it known that she was not in a healthy headspace when she agreed to take a caretaker job at a secluded mountain estate near a little place folks call Panther Hollow. Her life had just blown apart in every possible way. A 5-year relationship, one she honestly believed would end in a ring and a wedding, collapsed practically overnight. The breakup twisted her world upside down, leaving her spiraling into a heavy fog she couldn't claw out of. When they separated, she lost the apartment they had shared. Most of their mutual friends quietly drifted to his side, leaving her eating dinner alone at her mom's kitchen table like she was 18 again instead of turning 30. She felt like she was sinking, like everything she had built suddenly didn't matter. And to make it worse, she had been laid off from her marketing job 2 months prior. Her savings were evaporating. Her inbox was full of unanswered resumes. Every day felt like walking in circles. She was barely eating, barely sleeping, barely functioning. So when she stumbled across a job posting online for a live-in caretaker position at a remote mountain property, she didn't think twice. She skimmed the description, room and board included, modest pay, basic household responsibilities, and she didn't bother reading much more. It sounded like a lifeline, a chance to disappear for a while, a way out. The interview happened over the phone, with a man who introduced himself as Harold Hal Cutler. He had a gravelly mountain drawl and the kind of strained breathing that suggested decades of cigarettes. He explained that the property had been in his family since the 1920s, built by his grandfather deep in the woods outside eastern Kentucky. The nearest town was over an hour away, and the property could only be reached by a winding dirt road that didn't always cooperate with the weather. He told her he was getting too old to make the trip regularly and needed someone trustworthy to stay there permanently. Keep the place warm in winter, tidy the grounds, do simple maintenance, and keep an eye on things. His adult children wanted nothing to do with the estate. Lauren accepted the job without even asking for photos. Hal seemed lonely but polite, a man clinging to a family home he didn't want to sell. He wired her the first month's pay in advance so she could buy winter supplies. Then he told her to meet him at a small gas station off Route 60, where he'd guide her to the property. She packed everything she owned into her beat-up sedan and drove down winding county roads with a knot of mixed relief and dread twisting in her stomach. Hal was already waiting when she pulled in, leaning against an old teal pickup that looked like it had survived a few lifetimes. He looked mid-70s, maybe older, tall and weathered, with striking pale eyes that seemed to study every detail around him. His handshake was so firm it made her fingers ache. After a few minutes of small talk, he told her to follow close behind. Said the road up the mountain was easy to miss. The pavement turned to gravel. The gravel turned to rutted dirt. Trees swallowed the sky. Towering old-growth trunks crowded the narrow road, blocking out most of the afternoon light. Lauren focused on keeping his truck in view as the mountain rises grew steeper and the forest pressed in tighter with every mile. There were no mailboxes, no driveways, no other houses. Just endless woods and the occasional glimpse of a distant ridge. By the time they reached the property, the sun was dipping behind the ridges. The estate appeared suddenly, as if the trees had been hiding it on purpose. A massive 3-story structure made of dark stone and faded timber. The steep roofs, narrow windows, and overrun gardens made it look like a forgotten mansion from another century. Several outbuildings loomed nearby, sagging under decades of neglect. A cold shiver crept down Lauren's spine as she stepped out of her car. The place looked deserted, almost mournful. She told herself it was just nerves. Hal gave her a tour. His tone stayed polite, but oddly stiff, as if he were giving instructions rather than welcoming her in. Most rooms were empty or draped in dusty sheets. The kitchen worked, but felt trapped in the past. Old appliances, a wood-burning stove, a refrigerator that buzzed like a dying bee. Her quarters were upstairs, a small bedroom and bathroom that felt dated but surprisingly cozy once Hal explained the quirky heating system. He walked her through the practical stuff, the fuse box behind the pantry door, the water shutoff under the stairs, the propane tank behind the house that needed periodic refilling. Then came the rules. She wasn't to enter the basement, ever. That area was locked, and he had personal belongings stored there that he didn't want disturbed. He would handle anything needed down there. She wasn't to invite anyone to the property, period. The estate was private, and he valued his privacy. She wasn't to leave without letting him know first. If she needed groceries or supplies, she should give him a list for his next visit. Cell service didn't reach this far, but there was a landline in the kitchen. It worked, he said. Lauren agreed to all of it, too desperate for stability to question anything. Hal left after sunset, his truck lights disappearing slowly down the dirt road, leaving her alone in the giant house. That first night, she slept in a sleeping bag on the floor, every creak of the old structure jolting her awake. She tried to tell herself the noises were just the building settling, but some sounded alarmingly like footsteps moving through empty rooms. The first few weeks passed quietly. She cleaned, she cooked simple meals, she read near the fireplace. Hal visited twice with supplies. He was friendly, but his eyes followed her too closely, making her feel like a deer being studied by a hunter. She tried to brush off the feeling. One day she discovered the basement door. Heavy wood, reinforced with a modern deadbolt and a thick padlock. She tried the handle out of habit, but it didn't budge. Hal had been serious about keeping it sealed. At night, she caught herself imagining what might be behind that door. She rationalized it as harmless. Family heirlooms, old trunks, dusty papers. Nothing sinister. But the 6th week changed everything. Hal's visits became more frequent, his questions more personal, his stays longer, and every time his presence seemed heavier, darker. Olivia didn't remember much from the ride to the sheriff's office. Just the heat blasting from the dashboard vents and the couple's soft, worried murmurs drifting in and out like half-remembered dreams. She kept her eyes fixed on the blurred winter fields rolling past the window, trying to convince herself she was finally safe. But even with the sun climbing over the ridgeline, she couldn't shake the feeling that Earl was somewhere close, watching from the timberline like a hunter waiting for his chance. The moment she stepped through the sheriff's office door,
the adrenaline drained out of her body. Her knees buckled, and she had to lean on the reception desk just to keep herself upright. The deputy at the counter, a stout man with thinning hair and a badge that looked too shiny to be old, hurried over to help her. He guided her to a chair, grabbed a blanket, and handed her a styrofoam cup of coffee that steamed against her numb fingertips.
When she tried to speak, everything came spilling out in a frantic, jumbled flood. Weeks of fear, suspicion, the cold dread that had built up inside her like poison. She told them about the basement she wasn't allowed to enter, the phone cutting out, Earl's sudden interest in her personal life. She tried to explain the way her belongings had moved when she wasn't in the room, how her locked door had somehow swung open in the middle of the night. She described the scratching noises underneath the kitchen floor, noises that made her skin crawl even now. The deputies exchanged looks she recognized all too well. Professionally polite doubt, the kind reserved for people who'd been isolated too long or who weren't thinking clearly. But Olivia knew what she'd felt in that house. She hadn't imagined the way Earl watched her. She hadn't imagined the silence when he let the landline die. She hadn't imagined waking up to a stranger's presence in her room. And deep down, she knew she hadn't imagined the screams she sometimes thought she heard through the floorboards, cut off too quickly, as if someone else had dreamed them too. Despite their skepticism, the deputies agreed to drive back with her. It took a couple hours to round up enough people, grab a cruiser that could handle the snow-packed roads, and wait for a plow to clear the highway turnoff. Olivia rode in the back seat, hands shaking, heart pounding as the hills rose around them. Every mile up that winding road felt heavier, like the mountains themselves were warning her not to go back. The house came into view just as the sun dipped behind a bank of clouds. Seeing it again made her stomach twist. The steep roof lines, the dark stone, the way the windows seemed to stare. It all looked worse now without Earl's truck sitting out front. The place felt abandoned, but not empty. As if whatever lived in the walls was holding its breath, waiting. The deputy leading the search banged on the front door, called Earl's name, and got no answer. Just the hollow echo of his voice bouncing down the long corridors. The house was freezing inside, colder than it should have been, even with winter outside. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, trying not to collapse under the memories rushing back in. Every creak, every gust of wind through the eaves made her jump. It didn't take long for one of the deputies to find the locked basement door. The deadbolt gleamed in the flashlight beam like an accusation. They called for bolt cutters. The metallic snap of the lock breaking felt like something splitting inside her chest. When the door finally swung open, the smell hit first. Stale, metallic, and wrong. A smell that had nothing to do with old pipes or mildew. Olivia instantly stepped back, covering her mouth with her sleeve. The deputy leading the way froze at the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam landing on something Olivia couldn't see yet. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. She followed slowly, gripping the rail so tightly her knuckles turned white. Halfway down, she could see the whole room, and wished she couldn't. The basement was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't filled with heirlooms or tools or dusty family junk. It was a bunker, a shrine, a prison. A cot sat pushed against the far wall, thin mattress stained and sunken. A metal bucket sat next to it with a lid that didn't fit right. Heavy chains, bolted straight into the stone foundation, hung loosely like they were waiting for someone new. Across from the cot was a long desk lined with monitors, rows of dead screens facing the wall like open black eyes. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting to cameras she recognized immediately. She'd seen those angles. The living room, the upstairs hallway, the small window above her shower. Her stomach lurched. Along the opposite wall, photographs were pinned in neat rows. grainy snapshots taken through those same hidden lenses. Women sleeping, washing dishes, folding clothes. Women who thought they were alone. Some images were decades old, their colors faded into sepia. Others looked recent. Too recent. A filing cabinet sat underneath the photos, drawers labeled with women's names she didn't recognize. Dates scrawled beside them like a grim ledger of arrivals and disappearances. One folder sat open on the desk. Her name was on it. Inside were photos of her sleeping, brushing her teeth, changing clothes. Notes in Earl's jagged handwriting. What time she woke up each day. What she ate. How long she spent in the shower. What she talked about on the phone before it cut out. Her entire life at the estate, recorded like she was part of some twisted experiment. She could barely breathe. The deputies went silent. No skepticism now. No polite nods. Just horror. The search for Earl lasted weeks. Bloodhounds, drones, volunteer teams combing the woods. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of clothing. Only his truck, abandoned near the Tennessee line like he'd stepped out of it and dissolved into the forest. But Olivia never believed he simply vanished. People like him didn't quit. They waited. And sometimes, when she wakes to a creak outside her apartment door, she swears she can smell the cold mountain air clinging to someone standing just out of sight. Someone patient. Someone who remembers her. Someone who isn't done. Story 3. Marcus had only been on the job a few months when everything in his life took a hard, unforgettable turn. Fresh out of college with a forestry degree and that go-get-'em attitude new grads always seem to have, he thought landing a seasonal gig with Blue Ridge Timber and Survey was the start of something big. Good paycheck, all woods work, and a chance to wander places most people only ever see on postcards. Yeah, it felt like a dream. His boss, a wiry old mountain guy named Bo Renner, had been kicking around those western North Carolina woods longer than Marcus had even been alive. On the first day out, with the smell of pine sap thick in the air, Bo gave him a warning that didn't land the way it should have. "Phones don't mean squat out here," Bo growled through a wad of tobacco. "GPS gets stupid this deep in the mountains. These ridges hide things. Things folks sometimes ought to leave hidden." Marcus had laughed it off back then. He wasn't laughing later. It was late September. Air crisp enough that their breath fogged as they hiked through the Nantahala National Forest, pushing deep into a section of old-growth timber the company was eyeing for selective cutting. No roads reached that pocket of woods anymore. The last logging crews that came through there must have packed up in the 1970s, leaving behind overgrown tracks that barely counted as trails. But Bo somehow knew every rock and hollow. He navigated the mountains like someone reading a map only he could see, pointing out landmarks Marcus would have walked straight past. A crooked spruce here, a ridgeline bending the wrong way there. It was like the man had the forest wired into his bones. 3 days in, the two of them were camping beside a cold mountain creek. Their tents pitched on gravel so rough, Marcus swore his back might never unkink. When he offered to scout ahead and flag a line of boundary trees, Bo handed him a radio and a handheld GPS that had more duct tape than plastic showing. "Radio won't get far past a mile," Bo warned. "Don't count on it. Ridges eat signals." Still, Marcus took off alone, compass in hand, paint can clattering on his belt. He walked for a couple hours, marking trees with bright orange blazes as he went. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're not. Then he saw it. A trail, thin, straight, suspiciously neat, cutting across his route like someone had carved it with intention. It wasn't on any of their maps, and it didn't look like deer or bear had made it. The line was too clean, too purposeful. Curiosity poked at him until he finally muttered, "Screw it, I'll follow it a minute," and stepped off his survey path. The brush closed behind him as he trailed it uphill, through thick laurel, and around hulking moss-covered boulders. After 20 minutes of climbing, the trail spit him out into a clearing that absolutely shouldn't have been there. A perfect little bowl carved out of the forest. The trees inside it had been cut long ago, their stumps melting back into the earth, and smack in the middle sat the skeletal remains of an old logging camp. 3 cabins, or whatever was left of them, leaned drunkenly in the weeds, roofs half caved in, boards sagging like wet cardboard. Sheds and storage buildings drooped nearby, their gray boards warped from decades of storms. Everything about the place felt wrong, heavy, like the forest didn't want it there. Still, Marcus did what surveyors do. He documented. He snapped photos, walked slow, kept an eye on weak floorboards. Old timber camps weren't rare in Appalachia. This one felt older than most, though. Real old. He stepped inside the first cabin, only to find rusted hand tools scattered across the floor and a busted cot sitting in the corner. Shafts of light poured through holes in the roof, stirring the motes drifting through the stale air. The second cabin was more of the same, except for a stack of newspapers crammed between the wall logs. Dated 1974. That actually stopped him cold. 1974 didn't match what he was seeing. These buildings looked like they'd been abandoned long before disco was even a thing. The third cabin was where everything went sideways. He'd barely taken 10 steps inside when the floor groaned under him, one board tilting just enough for him to notice. He nudged it with his boot. It shifted, and beneath it, instead of dirt or bedrock, he spotted a rectangular wooden box, big, heavy-looking, and sealed up tight with a rusted padlock. His pulse kicked up. He knew better. Every sensible thought told him to turn around and pretend he hadn't noticed. But something else, curiosity, instinct, maybe even fear, pushed him onward. He found a discarded iron pipe in a corner, jammed it under the lock, and snapped the corroded metal with one hard heave. He flipped the lid open, and the world changed. Inside were personal belongings, too many to brush off as abandoned junk. A worn leather pocketbook with an ID inside, faded but readable. A man's wristwatch frozen at a weird, specific time, 2:15. A pair of reading glasses with cracked lenses. A kid's stuffed bunny, half-rotted, one button eye missing. And the photos. Stacks of Polaroids. Dozens of them, maybe more. Color drained from Marcus's face as he flipped through image after image. Frightened people inside what looked like this very camp. Dirty, hurt, tied up. Some staring at the camera with wild, pleading eyes. He gagged before he even realized it was happening, stumbling outside to vomit into the weeds. His hands shook violently as he wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He tried the radio. Nothing but static. He checked the GPS, coordinates glitching, bouncing all over like the device was possessed. Panic clawed up his throat, but he forced himself to think. He took pictures of everything, the box, the contents, the cabin itself. Then he selected a handful of items from inside the chest and shoved them into his pack. He knew he shouldn't move evidence, but something in his gut screamed that he had to. Otherwise, no one would ever believe him. The hike back felt like a nightmare stretched thin. Every branch snap made him spin around. Every gust of wind sounded like someone breathing behind him. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt aware. He didn't stop moving until the faint glow of their campfire flickered through the trees. Michael and Rye pushed hard to reach the ranger station by early afternoon, both of them stumbling out of the woods looking like they'd been dragged through hell. The ranger on duty, a wiry guy named Dawson with a stiff mustache and a face that always looked suspicious even when he wasn't trying, listened with folded arms and a raised brow. He didn't outright call Michael a liar, but the disbelief was written all over him. Still, protocol was protocol, and he radioed his supervisor before escorting them into a back room to take a formal statement. It took almost an hour for Michael to get through everything without shaking. He laid the evidence he'd brought on the table, careful, as if the items might burn him. And Dawson's expression shifted when he saw the old Polaroids. The mood in the room went from skeptical to alarmed in a heartbeat. By the time the sheriff's office was notified, the ranger station felt like it was bracing for a storm. The next 3 days dragged by as agencies scrambled to assemble a proper search and forensic team. Michael barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the camp again. The leaning cabins, the rotten floorboards, the box full of memories that should have never been buried in the first place. Rye tried to talk to him, tried to get him to eat. But Michael felt like the forest was still clinging to him, squeezing his lungs from the inside. When they finally went back, this time with deputies, rangers, trackers, and a couple of federal specialists, Michael felt sick the entire hike in. The woods seemed quieter than they'd been before. No wind, no birds. Even the crunch of boots on the leaf litter sounded muffled. As they approached the clearing, several officers stopped and stared, stunned that the place wasn't just a vivid nightmare. The cabins stood there exactly as he remembered, like props from some forgotten horror movie. The forensics crew wasted no time setting up tents, cameras, and grid lines. They marked the area with orange tape until the camp looked like a crime scene frozen in time. The box Michael found was still there, though obviously disturbed from when he'd opened it. They cataloged the items one by one. Wallets warped by decades of weather. Watches locked forever at their final minute. Toys that once belonged to children who never made it home. The Polaroids were carefully sealed in evidence bags as techs whispered to each other, shaken despite trying to look professional. The notebooks were perhaps the worst of all. Rows of neat handwriting filled every inch of the yellowed pages. It wasn't the frantic scrawl of a madman. This writing was calm, methodical. Entries described subjects, routes, restraints, and observations written with a cold detachment that made Michael's skin crawl. Whoever wrote them hadn't been sloppy or impulsive. They'd been organized, patient, comfortable. The jewelry at the bottom of the trunk, wedding bands, pendants, bracelets, was enough to bring several hardened deputies to silence. Too many pieces, too many people, too many lives swallowed by the dark. After a week of digging, sifting, and scanning, the team located disturbances in the earth behind the smallest cabin. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and flagged several patches of soil that looked altered. The excavations that followed were slow and somber. Bones surfaced, partial skeletons, fractured skulls, clothing fibers fused to the dirt. Some remains were found beneath what had once been a root cellar. Others had been buried so shallow that the forest had nearly reclaimed them. Forensic experts confirmed that these weren't accidents, not lost hikers, not animal attacks. These were human beings who had suffered at the hands of someone who knew how to hide in the mountains, someone who counted on isolation to cover their tracks. Over the next months, the personal items were linked to missing persons cases, stretching from the late 60s through the mid-70s. 7 individuals. A pair of backpackers who vanished near the Appalachian Trail in '71. A family of 3 last seen pitching a tent near a remote overlook in '73. a hitchhiking couple who disappeared off Highway 19 in '68. Cases that had haunted investigators for decades suddenly had a horrifying connective thread. And yet, despite all the evidence, the person responsible remained a ghost. The handwriting didn't match anyone in state or federal databases. No prints survived. No blood that could be used for DNA. Whoever had done this had walked away before modern forensics existed, before the world became smaller and harder to hide in. Older locals were questioned, but memories blurred with time. Some recalled rumors from the logging days, men refusing to work certain hollows because the air felt wrong. Others remembered hearing strange sounds echoing off the ridges at night decades ago. But no one had a name. No one remembered a stranger living off the grid. Whatever tracks the killer had left were long gone, washed away by seasons of rain and generations of forest regrowth. Investigators eventually followed the red ink markings from the notebooks, searching other locations across the region. Some spots were nothing more than empty clearings. Others had crumbled foundations or rusted equipment left over from past industries. No additional camps were ever found. Either the maps were misdirection or the forest had erased whatever had once been there. When the dust settled, the case was labeled inactive, unsolved, but not forgotten. The victims' families were finally told what had happened, given the bittersweet closure that came far too late. But the person who'd taken their lives was never identified. By now they'd be elderly, if they were still alive at all. They might have died decades ago. They might have moved states away. They might have built other camps in other forests, places no one had ever stumbled upon. For Michael, the discovery changed everything. The woods, once a place he cherished, now felt like a giant breathing organism full of shadows and unanswered questions. He finished his contract season out of obligation, but every ridge made him tense, every hollow made him sweat. He transferred into an office job as soon as he could, trading compass bearings for spreadsheets, maps for satellite imagery. Yet sometimes, late at night in that quiet cubicle, he still pulled up topographic maps of the Appalachian backcountry. He'd stare at all that empty green, the miles of unbroken wilderness with no roads, no houses, no cell signal. And he'd think about the camp waiting decades to be found, tucked behind ridges that swallowed sound. Then he'd wonder, how many more places like that were out there, hiding in the folds of the mountains, holding secrets the trees would never willingly give up, waiting for someone unlucky enough to find them. Story 4. Emma hadn't planned on coming back to the Appalachian backroads she once swore she'd never live in again. But life has a way of cornering you. Her grandmother, Margaret Holloway, stubborn as a mule even at 87, needed help after a nasty fall messed up her hip. Emma was the only one in the family who could step in. So she packed her apartment in Lexington, shoved her whole life into storage, and drove straight into the thick mountain silence she'd left behind years earlier. Margaret's place sat at the very dead end of Razorback Hollow Road, a twisting ribbon of asphalt cutting deep into the hills about 15 miles outside the town of Jenkins. Folks around there said the road got its name from an old feud-era ambush that painted the ground red. Others claimed the dirt ran that color naturally after rain. Whatever the truth, the name fit. The place always had a mean sort of energy, especially at night. Emma tried commuting at first, 3 trips a week from a tiny rental in Jenkins, while she arranged home care and debated moving in permanently. Even in bright daylight, the drive unsettled her. Towering rock walls on one side, steep drops on the other, no cell service, and woods so thick the sun barely punched through. At some bends, the branches knitted over the road like a tunnel. Nobody lived out there. Nobody patrolled. and the only repairs the county ever bothered with were haphazard patches on the worst potholes. Early October, on a Tuesday that had already wrung her out emotionally, her luck finally snapped. She'd stayed long past dark at her grandmother's house. Margaret had been clear-headed that evening, talking about Emma's late grandfather, sharing memories she didn't want to cut short. By the time she started down Razorback Hollow, the sky was pitch black and moonless. 7 miles outside town, her engine began coughing like it had swallowed gravel. She'd noticed it running rough for weeks, but with everything going on, she'd shoved the problem aside. Now the car shuddered, sputtered, and died altogether, leaving her rolling silently to a shaky stop on the narrow shoulder. She flicked the ignition 3 times. Nothing. Her phone had 0 signal. No surprise there. For a moment she just sat in the dark, listening to the cooling engine tick, trying not to panic. Her options were all trash. 8 miles uphill back to her grandmother's house, 7 miles downhill to town, or stay with the car and pray someone drove by this God-forsaken stretch. Even in daylight, she rarely passed another vehicle. She settled on waiting an hour. Someone had to come eventually. She locked the doors, switched on her hazards, and hugged her jacket around herself while the forest swallowed all sound. The flashing amber light barely touched the tree line. Everything beyond it was just pure black. 45 long minutes later, headlights finally appeared from the direction of town. Relief hit her so hard she almost laughed. She climbed out, waving both arms to flag them down. The vehicle rolled closer, an old beat-to-hell pickup that rattled like loose change in a dryer. It stopped behind her Honda, its high beams painting everything in stark white. A tall, rail-thin man in faded overalls and a trucker hat stepped out. He had a wide, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What seems to be the trouble, sweetheart?" he asked, stepping a little too close. Emma explained her car had stalled, thanked him for stopping, and asked if he had a phone or could maybe give her a ride into town. His gaze didn't stay on her face long, kept drifting. Something about the way he hovered set her nerves on edge. "No phone," he said. "Don't mess with all that mess. Live up yonder a bit. But I can give you a lift. Or I can take a peek under the hood. Good with engines." His eagerness felt wrong. Too quick, too eager. Instinct clawed up her spine. "Actually," she lied smoothly, "I already called the tow truck before my battery died. Shouldn't be long." His smile faltered a little. "You sure? Ain't no trouble?" "I'm sure," she repeated, edging toward her car. He just stood there, watching her in heavy silence. After a long moment, he shrugged and walked back to his truck. But he didn't leave. He just pulled forward a few feet and sat there with the engine idling, headlights still flooding her car. Emma slid into her seat and locked the doors again, hands shaking. Through the rear view, she saw him staring straight through his windshield at her. Minutes crawled by. Finally, in a desperate burst of hope, she twisted her key again, and the engine sputtered to life. Barely, but alive. She slammed the car into gear and drove, heart pounding. Behind her, the pickup rolled out and followed. He didn't tailgate. Didn't try to pass. Just matched her speed, every curve, every straightaway, as if he were waiting her out. Her hands hurt from gripping the wheel. She whispered prayers under her breath that the engine wouldn't quit again. 20 agonizing minutes later, the glow of Jenkins shimmered ahead like salvation. As soon as she crossed the town limit sign, the truck abruptly turned down a back road and vanished. Emma didn't stop until she reached the police station. She parked under the bright floodlights and sat trembling before she could force herself inside. The officer at the front desk listened intently. When she mentioned Razorback Hollow Road, something in his expression shifted. Concern, then recognition. He asked her to describe the man in the truck. She did. He nodded grimly, then made a phone call. 20 minutes later, a veteran state detective named Frank Morrison walked in. He looked exhausted in the way only lifelong cops do. He sat across from Emma and told her something that froze her from the inside out. Razorback Hollow had a reputation. Women had been disappearing off that road for decades. Not frequently, not predictably, but consistently enough that the pattern whispered beneath the surface. 6 confirmed disappearances since the late 70s. Maybe more. Drifters. Travelers. Women passing through with nobody to raise hell when they vanished. Bodies never recovered. No witnesses. No evidence. Just gone. Frank had worked 2 cases himself. They haunted him to this day. And now Emma had nearly become another. Emma sat frozen, her chest tight, as Detective Morrison leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "I've always figured it was someone local," he said, voice low. "Someone who knows every twist and turn, every blind corner of that hollow. Perfect for hunting, and nobody's around to notice." He shook his head. "But without bodies, without evidence, the cases just go cold. Filed away as statistics, things nobody outside the families give a damn about." Emma swallowed hard, trying to keep her stomach from flipping. She told him everything: the truck, the man, the way he had followed her. Morrison jotted down notes, but the frustration in his furrowed brow was plain. A tall, thin man, rusted pickup, mountain roads. He could be any one of 100 locals. "Stay off that road at night," Morrison warned, pressing his card into her hands. "If you ever see that truck again, you call me first. Don't wait. Don't stop." For the next few days, Emma couldn't shake it. The hollow had burrowed into her thoughts. She spent hours at the tiny Jenkins library, rifling through old microfilm newspapers. Buried in back pages, she found the small, dry articles: missing women, abandoned cars, people who had simply vanished into the hills. Some cases went back as far as the 1950s, maybe even the 40s. Details were scarce, but the pattern was chilling. Cars left on lonely roads, no struggle, no footprints, no signs of life afterward. She went to her grandmother, hoping Margaret might remember something. The old woman's face darkened at the mention of Razorback Hollow Road. "I remember," she said softly. "My own mama warned me never to drive that road alone. Never stop for anyone. That hollow, it's always had a bad name. People disappear. Always have." "Supernatural?" Emma asked hesitantly. Margaret shook her head. "No ghost stories here. Something worse. People. Maybe a family. Evil passed down like a sickness." She paused, then spoke of a girl she'd gone to school with, taken from that road in 1952. They found the car, never the girl. Her mother had told her of disappearances going even further back, to when the hollow was just a rough dirt path and the forest even wilder. The weight of it sank into Emma's chest. She knew she couldn't keep driving that road, couldn't keep exposing her grandmother or herself to the chance of becoming a statistic. The decision was made. Margaret would move to a care home in Lexington. Safer, more accessible, and miles away from the twisting, silent forest that hid so many secrets. As they packed, Margaret gave her one last warning. "There are places in these mountains," she said, voice steady but low, "where evil has put down roots so deep it becomes part of the land itself. Razorback Hollow is one of them. Stay away, Emma. Whatever lurks there, it's still hungry, still waiting. been feeding a long time. Emma left the mountains with a lump in her throat, promising herself she would never drive that road again. And she didn't. Razorback Hollow faded behind her, a winding scar on the land she had once called home. But the story didn't fade from her mind. Morrison's warnings, her grandmother's stories, the disappearing women, all burned in her memory. Detective Morrison retired 3 years later. The disappearances from Razorback Hollow haunted him until his last day on the force. They were the cases he could never solve, the ones that kept him awake at night and gnawed at his conscience. 6 confirmed women, possibly dozens more. The pattern so old it could have spanned generations. The trail dead, but not the menace. Somewhere, in the dark hollows and dense forests, the thing, or the person, responsible was still out there, waiting for the next car, the next traveler, the next mistake. Emma never drove through those mountains again, never stepped foot on that road. But sometimes she felt it calling to her. In quiet moments, she pictured the curves of Razorback Hollow, the shadows between the trees, and the dark headlights that had frozen her blood. She thought of the woman from 1952, the girls in the 1970s, and the others who had vanished without a trace. Their absence stretched like a hole in time, reminding her that some places in the world are carved out for horror, not for life. The mountains around Jenkins were vast, empty, and easy to disappear into. Even now, she imagined headlights glinting through the trees late at night, a stranger trapped on that road, caught by something unseen. The thought made her stomach churn. She told herself it was just a story, a cautionary tale. But she couldn't stop picturing the rusted pickup, idling in the shadows, waiting, patient. Years later, she still shivered when she heard the name Razorback Hollow whispered among locals. Tourists ignored the warnings. Locals avoided it like a bad memory. Some called it cursed. Some said it was just bad luck. Emma knew better. There was intelligence in the darkness, patience in the predator. It didn't need the law. It didn't need witnesses. The hollow provided everything: silence, isolation, and time. Margaret's warning stayed with her. Evil roots itself in the land, her grandmother had said. Emma believed it. Something had claimed that hollow decades ago and had grown comfortable there, hidden behind the trees, the rocks, the shadows. The disappearances hadn't stopped. They just waited. Hidden, patient, hungry. Emma tried to move on with her life, building a new routine, a safer existence far from the twisting hills. But sometimes, when she was alone, she would find herself tracing Razorback Hollow on an old map, imagining every curve, every blind bend, every shadowed overhang. She wondered how many more cars would stall, how many more travelers would make the fatal mistake of trusting a friendly stranger. She wondered how many more would vanish into the trees, just like the others, swallowed by the mountain that had no interest in returning them. And deep down, Emma knew the hollow would keep waiting. Not for her, not anymore, but for someone else, someone who didn't know its history, didn't heed its warnings. Somewhere out there, a car would break down, headlights flashing dimly in the forest, engine choking. And in the shadows, eyes would watch, calculating, patient, hungry. Razorback Hollow would claim again. Emma never returned. She never looked back. But the road, the disappearances, and the predator that lurked in those Appalachian trees remained a part of her story forever. Story 5. Back in 2018, the memory still gave Jesse the creeps whenever he thought about it. He had just started his first real gig as a county surveyor, mapping the most remote, barely charted corners of the Appalachian Mountains. covering stretches that spanned 3 counties in eastern Tennessee. The work paid well, and Jesse had always loved being outdoors, away from the bustle of people and the chaos of city life. At 26, fresh out of college with a degree in geomatics engineering, he was itching to prove himself in the field. The county had hired him specifically to resolve long-standing property disputes in areas that had never been properly surveyed. These were lands that had passed down through families for generations, often with nothing more than old handshake agreements and vague, century-old deeds. On modern maps, these hollows and ridges looked like blank spaces. Property lines were guesses, and ownership was usually claimed by whoever had lived there the longest. Jesse's boss, a grizzled veteran named Hank, had been with the county for 3 decades and warned him up front that some of these assignments could get hairy. There were folks deep in the mountains who didn't take kindly to outsiders and valued their isolation more than anything. "Always let someone know where you're headed," Hank said. "Carry a radio and a GPS. Trust your gut. If something feels off, bail. The survey can wait." Jesse's first few weeks were uneventful. He worked on parcels near the outskirts of small towns, set boundary markers, and resolved minor disputes without much drama. But in late June, Hank handed him an assignment that would test him like nothing before. The job involved roughly 3,000 acres deep in the mountains, land that had been tangled in ownership fights for over 40 years. Multiple families claimed it, each citing deeds that contradicted the others. The county needed exact survey data before any legal decisions could be made. The catch? The property was only reachable by hiking at least 8 miles from the nearest logging road where Jesse could leave his truck. Hank spread out topographic maps across the office table and pointed out landmarks Jesse would need to find. At the heart of the disputed land sat an old homestead, abandoned since the 70s. It would serve as Jesse's main reference point. From there, he'd have to grid the area, extending outward, marking boundary lines according to the historical deeds. He set off on a Monday morning in early July, backpack stuffed with surveying gear, camping supplies, and enough food and water for 3 days. The plan was simple: reach the old homestead, set up camp, complete his measurements, and hike back by Wednesday afternoon. He carried a GPS, a satellite phone for areas without coverage, and supplies enough to last a week if needed. The hike in was brutal. Sections of the logging road had washed out, forcing him to bushwhack through thick underbrush and clamber over fallen logs. The slopes were steep, the ground slick in places, and by the time he reached the homestead 6 hours later, he was wiped out. The structure was little more than a ruin. The roof had caved in, walls leaning precariously, yet the location matched his maps. The stone foundation was solid enough to mark his baseline. Jesse pitched his tent in a small clearing about 50 yards from the homestead, on a relatively flat patch near a spring that offered fresh water. The surrounding forest was ancient, trees towering high with thick canopies that dimmed the midday sun to a greenish gloom. An odd silence hung in the air. No birds chirping, no bugs buzzing, just wind through leaves and the occasional groan of wood. He spent the day taking baseline measurements, carefully marking initial survey points, his focus razor sharp. As evening came, he cooked a quick meal on a portable stove, crawled into his sleeping bag, and fell asleep almost instantly from sheer exhaustion. Sometime after midnight, he woke to faint voices drifting through the trees. Male, low, impossible to make out. He stayed frozen, listening. His watch read 2:30 a.m. Who could be out here at this hour, in this isolated stretch of wilderness? The voices moved, maybe circling his camp or passing nearby. He heard what sounded like clinking metal, tools, barrels, something industrial. 15 minutes later, silence returned. Jesse spent the rest of the night tense, hand on the bear spray in his tent, sleep shallow and uneasy. By morning, he scouted the area around camp, looking for signs of intruders. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the spring caught his attention. At least 3 different people, judging by size and tread. The tracks led northeast, deeper into the forest. An old, barely visible trail ran alongside them. Jesse debated reporting it to Hank via satellite phone, but his curiosity, and a nod of apprehension, pushed him to follow the trail for a short stretch. The path climbed steadily along a steep ridge. Branches cleared and rocks shifted to make footing easier. Someone was clearly maintaining this trail, keeping it passable despite its isolation. And then, without warning, the forest opened up into a large clearing. At its center stood multiple structures, well-maintained and clearly active. Vehicles, trucks, ATVs, and industrial equipment hidden under tarps were scattered about. Generators hummed, and a sharp, chemical smell stung Jesse's nose. Meth lab. There was no other explanation. As he began to retreat quietly, a voice called out. 3 men appeared on the trail behind him, rifles casually at the ready. One, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, demanded to know what he was doing. Jesse stammered the truth. County surveyor, property dispute, lost his way. The men exchanged a wordless glance. "Come with us," the bearded man said. It wasn't a question. They led him into the compound, revealing the full scale. Barrels of chemicals, tables covered in manufacturing equipment, more vehicles. This wasn't a backyard operation. It was industrial, organized, worth millions. Jesse was ushered into one of the makeshift buildings, his heart hammering so hard he thought they might hear it over the hum of generators. Inside, tables were stacked with barrels, chemical containers, and half-finished product. Men whispered in corners, their faces obscured by shadows. Every second felt like an eternity. He knew they couldn't just let him walk away. He'd seen too much. His mind raced. He had to convince them he was harmless, that his survey work had nothing to do with their operation, that he wasn't a cop or a snitch. He spoke carefully, explaining again that he was mapping property boundaries for the county, stumbled off the logging road, and had no interest in their business. The bearded man studied him silently, expression unreadable, before finally nodding. "They checked your story," the man said. "Found your truck, saw your equipment. You're who you say you are." His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "You can leave, but you follow our rules." Jesse swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," he muttered. "Pack up and hike out," the man instructed. "Tell the county the terrain's too rough to survey accurately. Say they'd need helicopters and special gear. Forget everything you saw here. If anyone finds out you've been here, we'll know." To drive the point home, one of the men produced Jesse's wallet from his pack. His ID, driver's license, address, all of it. Another showed him a phone with photos of his apartment, and even pictures taken through his window. The message was clear. They had been watching, and they could reach him any time. Jesse nodded frantically, agreeing to every demand. They walked him back to his campsite, keeping close enough that he could feel the invisible weight of their rifles behind him. He packed his gear with shaking hands, and the men followed silently all the way to his truck. Once he was behind the wheel, they melted back into the forest, disappearing as if they had never been there. He drove straight to the nearest town, hands trembling as he signed into a motel. He sat in the dimly lit room for hours, debating what to do next. Report it and risk retaliation? Stay silent and let the operation continue? Fear won. He called Hank, telling him the survey couldn't proceed because the terrain was too tough, that a helicopter would be required. He left out everything he'd seen. Yet, he couldn't let it go completely. 3 days later, sitting at a payphone in a different town, Jesse made an anonymous call to state police. He gave them the location of the compound and described the operation. No name, no identifying details, just the information. He hung up and left, heart racing. 2 weeks later, the news hit. A multi-agency raid had taken place, seizing one of the largest meth operations in Tennessee history. 17 arrests were made, and millions of dollars worth of drugs and equipment were confiscated. Public reports credited months of undercover work. No mention of the anonymous tip. But Jesse knew, and apparently someone else did too. About a month later, he returned to his apartment to find a note slipped under his door. No envelope, just a scrap of paper with a few handwritten words. "We know what you did. Some of us got away. We're still watching." The message was simple, terrifying, and direct. Jesse didn't hesitate. He quit his job the next day, broke his lease, and moved out of state. Now he worked in an office, far from the mountains, analyzing satellite imagery and generating digital maps. He avoided the wilderness at all costs, never putting himself alone in places where no one could help him. Even now, years later, he couldn't shake the memory. Somewhere in those Appalachian ridges, people were still out there, watching, waiting, angry at the loss of their operation. Jesse had learned a hard truth. In these vast, empty stretches of mountains, the law isn't always in charge. Justice wasn't meted out by courts or police. It was enforced in the shadows, where nobody could hear you scream, and no one would ever find your body. He often thought back to that night when the voices had circled his camp, the faint clanking of metal that had made his blood run cold. The isolation of those mountains wasn't just physical. It was a kind of danger all its own, a place where rules didn't apply, and where strangers who wandered in could vanish without a trace. Jesse remembered the look in the bearded man's eyes, the calm, calculated way he'd assessed him, the weight of implied threat. That look had burned into Jesse's mind, a reminder that even in the modern world, there were places where human law was powerless, and survival depended entirely on instinct and luck. He never underestimated the wilderness again. Every time he passed a logging road or remote trail, his mind replayed the events over and over, measuring distances, noting escape routes, remembering the smell of chemicals, the hum of generators, the metallic tang of fear in the air. He'd escaped, but the mountains had marked him. Even in his safer, office-bound life, Jesse couldn't ignore the lesson. In the Appalachians, there were pockets of lawlessness that thrived where no one could interfere. People who wanted to stay hidden could do so easily, and they had ways of enforcing their rules that didn't involve courts or cops. The mountains were beautiful, yes, but they were also a place of deep, patient menace. He sometimes wondered if those men were still out there, still running the trails, still maintaining hidden compounds, still capable of watching anyone who strayed too close. The thought chilled him, and he knew it always would. There was no escaping the knowledge that in those vast, empty woods, some forms of power didn't require technology, money, or influence, just the patience to wait and the willingness to act. Jesse never returned to that part of Tennessee. He avoided hiking alone, stayed away from logging roads and backcountry trails, and kept his life firmly in the realm of the predictable. But the mountains remained in his memory, a reminder that even today, somewhere out there, in the thick forests and forgotten hollows, justice could still be delivered in the darkness. And sometimes, it was far from fair. Story 6. This happened in the fall of 2024. Ava and her hiking buddy Lila were tackling a rugged section of trail deep in West Virginia's New River Gorge. The two had been friends since college, drawn together by a shared obsession with backcountry hiking and long weekends spent in the wilderness. Ava, 32, was a seasoned hiker who had completed stretches of the Appalachian Trail and countless weekend trips across the eastern mountains. Lila, 28, was slightly younger but just as capable, always eager to chase the next trail adventure. They had spent months planning this particular trip, poring over maps, trail guides, and topographic charts, aiming for a route that would carry them well away from the tourist-packed overlooks and crowded campgrounds. The New River Gorge fit the bill perfectly. Thousands of untamed acres, trails barely traveled outside the height of summer. It was early October, past the summer crush, before the throngs of leaf peepers arrived. A perfect window for solitude and reflection. Their plan was a 4-day loop, roughly 40 miles through some of the gorge's most isolated terrain. They parked at a trailhead off Route 19, signed the registry, hoisted their packs, and began their descent into the canyon. The first day was stunning. They followed a ridge that gave them breathtaking views of the river far below, then dropped into old-growth forest to camp near a bubbling creek. They didn't see a soul, just the wind, the river, and the rustle of wildlife. It was exactly the kind of escape they'd been craving. The next day carried them further into the backcountry. The trail ran parallel to the river, winding through increasingly rugged and secluded terrain. It was clear that few had walked this path in recent memory. Leaves and fallen branches obscured the trail in spots, forcing them to track the occasional blaze painted on trees. For lunch, they stopped at a small waterfall, filtering water from the pool and munching trail mix while marveling that they had such a beautiful stretch of wilderness all to themselves. Late afternoon brought the encounter. As they crested a ridge and began the descent to their next planned campsite, a man appeared sitting on a fallen log. He stood as they approached, smiling warmly, his face weathered, mid-40s, dressed in worn but functional hiking gear. "Name's Daniel," he said, introducing himself. "I'm section hiking through the area. Been out about a week." Ava and Lila stopped, as hikers often do on remote trails. Daniel asked about their route, how long they'd been out, if they'd seen anyone else. His questions seemed standard trail small talk. Yet Ava felt a flicker of unease she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered, or how he blocked the trail so they had to step around him. Something about him triggered a deep, instinctive warning. Daniel mentioned that he was camped at the same site they'd planned, about 2 miles further down the trail, enjoying the solitude for a couple of nights already. He suggested they join him, said there was plenty of space, that it would be nice to have company. Lila seemed tempted, but Ava's gut flared red. "No thanks," Ava said quickly. "We're planning to push on a bit further." It was a lie, but it felt natural. Daniel's easy smile faded. He asked again if they were sure, warning that the next decent campsite was at least 6 miles away and the terrain was rough. Ava thanked him for the heads up, insisting they were strong hikers who preferred to keep moving. After a tense pause, Daniel stepped aside, giving them space. Ava glanced back once. He was still standing there, watching them slip down the trail. Once they were out of earshot, Lila asked why Ava had fibbed. Ava explained her unease, the instinct that screamed something wasn't right. Lila hadn't felt it as strongly, but trusted her friend's judgment. They altered their route, taking a side trail to a different campsite Daniel wouldn't know about. It added 3 extra miles, but both agreed it was worth it for peace of mind. By sunset, they reached a small clearing beside a stream tucked into a narrow valley. They set up their tent quickly, cooked a simple dinner, and whispered about Daniel. Ava still couldn't shake the sense of danger. There was a quality in his eyes she couldn't name, but recognized as something primal, something dangerous. Lila chalked it up to nerves. They'd been alone in the woods, adrenaline running high. But Ava knew better. They turned in early, exhausted from the long day and extra mileage. Ava lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the forest, never fully relaxing. Sleep finally came, only to be shattered hours later when Lila shook her. "Someone's out there," Lila whispered. Footsteps, heavier than a deer or any wildlife. Ava froze. The sounds moved around the tent, trying to be quiet but not quite managing. They were trapped miles from the nearest trail junction, and someone had followed them. A long pause. Then close. Breathing, just outside the tent. Ava reached for her phone, hoping to use it as light or call for help if there was signal. But before she could, a voice called from the dark. "Ava. Lila." The voice drew out their names slowly. Daniel. He knew they had lied, knew they'd changed course to avoid him. He had tracked them through the forest, calm, conversational, but with an edge of anger, anticipation. Lila began to cry quietly. Ava gripped her hand. They had to move. Staying in the tent was a death trap. Ava whispered their plan. On her count, unzip and run. Desperate, but it was all they had. 3, 2, 1. She yanked the zipper down. They burst out into the night. Daniel was there, under a sky littered with stars, but caught off balance. Ava pushed past him, Lila behind, and they ran blindly into the forest. No light, no bearings, branches whipping, roots tripping. Behind them, the sound of pursuit. Hours felt like minutes until lights suddenly cut through the dark. Flashlights, voices calling. They screamed for help. Within moments, 5 hikers, a scout troop, and their leaders appeared. Daniel vanished. The scout leaders searched but found no trace. Their tent was slashed, belongings scattered. They packed what they could and hiked out with the scouts. At the trailhead, park rangers took their statement seriously and began a search. But Daniel had disappeared as if he'd never existed. Over the past 15 years, rangers explained off the record, 5 solo female hikers had vanished in the gorge. Bodies never recovered. Gear sometimes left slashed at remote campsites. Theories ranged from accidents to predation, but some suspected something far darker. A predator moving unseen through the backcountry. Lila never hiked again. Ava continued, but always with company, always near help. She still thinks of Daniel, wonders how many others he hunted through those Appalachian forests, and fears for the women whose disappearances remain unsolved. Somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness with no maps or cell signal, he is still waiting. Ava and Lila had barely caught their breath at the trailhead when the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The adrenaline that had fueled their flight through the forest slowly ebbed, leaving them jittery and raw. They sat on the edge of the parking lot, Lila hugging her knees, Ava scanning the tree line as if expecting Daniel to materialize from the shadows. Rangers interviewed them, taking detailed notes on the encounter. They were polite, professional, but there was a tension in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that the gorge was wild enough to harbor people like him. "He's clever," one ranger said quietly. "Knows the land. Moves without leaving a trace. We've seen patterns like this before, but there's no way to catch someone who doesn't want to be found." Ava nodded, the words doing little to calm the gnawing fear inside her. That night, back at a motel in Fayetteville, Lila couldn't stop replaying the footsteps, the voice, the way Daniel had tracked them. She had trouble sleeping, jumping at every sound. Ava, while quieter, felt a similar unease. Her mind wandered constantly to the women who had vanished over the years. Who were they? Did they sense danger the way Ava had? And where were their remains? Hidden somewhere deep in the woods, never to be discovered? In the days that followed, Ava researched everything she could find. Old news reports, missing person files, local lore. She discovered names, ages, and the vague details of the women who had disappeared. Some were seasoned hikers, others just weekend backpackers. All had vanished in the most remote parts of the gorge, far from the trailheads. Gear occasionally turned up, a torn backpack here, a pair of hiking boots there, but never a body. The pattern was chilling, unmistakable. Despite the fear, Ava's hiking didn't stop entirely, but it changed. She no longer ventured alone. She avoided isolated sections of the gorge, sticking to well-traveled trails. She invested in a GPS tracker, carried emergency beacons, and always had a reliable way to call for help. Each time she stepped onto a trail, a small part of her mind was scanning the tree line, the brush, the ridges, wondering if someone, or something, was watching. Lila, on the other hand, retreated from backcountry hiking altogether. The experience had broken her confidence, shattered the sense of freedom the wilderness once offered. Even a simple weekend walk in the hills left her tense, her imagination conjuring shadows that might not be there, but could be. Ava thought about Daniel constantly. Who was he? How long had he been out there? How many people had he followed, stalked, taken? The thought of him lurking in the vast wilderness, knowing every nook and cranny, sent chills down her spine. She imagined him moving silently through the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to come alone, to make a wrong turn, to step into his carefully curated trap. She kept her own record, discreetly noting every detail she could remember. His appearance, the way he spoke, the location of their encounter. Ava wasn't sure what good it would do, but it gave her a sense of control. If law enforcement could ever connect the dots, she wanted her account to be accurate. Months later, Ava returned to the New River Gorge with a small, trusted group, determined to map the trails in the backcountry for safety purposes. She refused to go alone. The wilderness still drew her, but she approached it with caution, awareness, and a quiet respect for the dangers lurking beyond the trail markers. Even then, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, the possibility that someone who had once followed her might still be out there, blending into the shadows, waiting. The park rangers remained vigilant but frustrated. Daniel, or whatever name he might have used, had vanished without a trace. Despite searches, checkpoints, and monitoring, there was never a sign of him again. His campsite was gone, no trace of a fire ring, no discarded gear, nothing that could tie him to the wilderness except the terror he had left behind. Ava often thought about the missing hikers over the years. Some were women just like her and Lila, fit, experienced, cautious, but even that wasn't enough. The vast wilderness, the rugged terrain, and the complete isolation made them easy targets for someone who knew the backcountry intimately. Ava imagined their final moments, startled footsteps in the dark, whispered voices carried on the wind, and the sudden, shocking realization that no one was coming. Her experiences had left a permanent mark. She couldn't hike as freely as she once had. Solitude no longer felt safe. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch triggered a memory, a fear, a caution that had not existed before. And yet, she also understood something essential. The wilderness was beautiful, wild, and dangerous all at once. Respecting it meant acknowledging both its majesty and its threats. She stayed in touch with the rangers, reporting any strange sightings, unusual tracks, or signs that someone might be living off the grid. Each tip they received seemed minor, inconclusive, but Ava knew better. Out there, in the dense forests of the gorge, someone was skilled, patient, and careful. The maps were incomplete, the signals weak, the shadows perfect for someone who didn't want to be seen. Time passed. Lila's fear kept her grounded, her outdoor adventures reduced to short, safe hikes near town. Ava continued, always mindful, always cautious, always alert. The memory of Daniel, his voice, his eyes, and the way he had stalked them through the forest never faded. Some nights she would dream of the darkness, the pursuit, the inescapable feeling of being watched. Each dream was a reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty, could also harbor predators beyond imagination. The case remained open, though inactive. No arrests, no closure, no answers. Somewhere in the New River Gorge, Daniel, or whatever he truly was, continued to move through the shadows, waiting for the next hiker who strayed too far from safety. He knew the land intimately, the hidden trails, the small clearings, the secret vantage points. He was patient, careful, and deadly in his own quiet way. Ava never forgot. She knew that in the vast backcountry, help could be miles away, and no one might hear a scream. The memory stayed with her, shaping every hike, every trip, every adventure. And in the deepest, most isolated stretches of the gorge, she imagined him still out there, watching, waiting, silent among the trees. The wilderness had given her freedom once, but now it also carried the knowledge that danger could exist in its shadows, unseen, unpredictable, and relentless. Some sights stick in your mind forever. The kind that twist your sense of reality and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. I learned that the hard way on a bitter December afternoon 2 years back, and the memory has shadowed me ever since. My name's Logan. I'm 31, a software developer, and I relocated to Asheville, North Carolina 5 years ago for work. I picked up mountain biking soon after as a way to stretch my legs, escape the glare of monitors, and lose myself in the forest. Over time, I pushed myself farther, seeking trails that weren't on maps, routes that most folks didn't dare tackle. The week between Christmas and New Year's is weird. Time feels suspended, like reality itself is holding its breath. Everyone else was busy with family, traveling, or recuperating from the holidays, leaving me alone with a few days off and an itch to explore. I had caught wind of some abandoned logging roads in Pisgah National Forest that reportedly connected to early 20th century mining sites. The tip came from a forum post by someone who claimed to have stumbled across it years ago. Directions were vague, and no official map marked the location. I spent hours cross-referencing satellite imagery with the cryptic forum descriptions until I thought I had pinpointed the area. It was tucked away, reachable only via forest roads overgrown and neglected for decades. The forecast promised clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s, crisp but doable. I packed extra layers, snacks, tools, and told a buddy my route before heading out early on a Tuesday morning. The first hour of riding was uneventful. The old forest road rutted and tangled with roots, but still rideable. The woods were stripped bare, skeletal, winter having leached the color from the trees. Everything was shades of brown and gray, the kind of scenery that makes the mountains feel raw, exposed, and eerily quiet. Side trails flickered past, some faintly marked, others barely perceptible under fallen branches. I stopped at each fork to check my GPS and notes, matching what I saw with my painstaking map work. By mid-morning, I found what looked like the turnoff described in the post, a faint break in the undergrowth more than a real path. The compass lined up, and the terrain fit the description. I shoved my bike through thick laurel and fallen logs, following what had once been a road, now swallowed by decades of forest. After roughly half a mile of slogging, the vegetation gave way. I emerged onto a wide path that clearly had been engineered. The slope was too consistent, the curves too deliberate to be natural. I pedaled for 20 minutes more, steadily climbing, until the trail opened into a long abandoned clearing. Young saplings and brambles were reclaiming the space, but the flattened ground and traces of gravel hinted at its artificial past. At the far end stood a wooden structure, partially caved in but still upright. 2 stories, steep roof, weathered boards warped and broken, windows empty and dark. It could have been a mining office or workers' quarters, though its isolation felt ominous. Leaning my bike against a tree, curiosity outweighed caution. The front door hung crooked, one hinge broken. A gentle push swung it open with a low groan. Inside, a stench hit me immediately. Rot, mold, and something else I couldn't name. The floor was littered with shattered glass, broken furniture, and dead leaves blown in through the broken windows. But the walls drew my gaze. Covered from floor to ceiling in cramped, frantic writing, pencil or charcoal, I couldn't tell. Every inch of surface filled with words. It wasn't typical graffiti. It looked like obsessive documentation, a log or journal spanning years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I shone my phone's light closer. The entries detailed observations, though of what was unclear. There were mentions of sounds from the treetops, signals at particular bearings, vocalizations recorded at specific hours. It read like field notes, but increasingly frantic. Supplies vanished. Strange arrangements of sticks and stones appeared around the clearing. Voices echoed in the forest, mimicking the writer's own calls. The air chilled in a way the winter couldn't account for. My instincts screamed to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the words. The entries grew personal, desperate. Footsteps on the roof at night, shadows moving in the corners, certainty that they were no longer alone. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. Upstairs, remnants of living quarters, cot, table, stove, were scattered and grimy. The walls here were plastered with the last, most frantic entries. The final entry, dated March 1973, was brief but horrifying. It has taken me. Below it, scratched deep into the wood rather than written, were 3 more words. Do not stay. I froze, my phone trembling in my hand. Then I noticed a darker patch in the corner, just like the text described. Not shadow. Something organic had left a mark over time. And that's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate creaking from below. My pulse spiked. The floorboards groaned again, and a faint, chilling voice whispered a single word. Hello. It was my voice, my exact pitch, my exact tone. I hadn't spoken, I hadn't moved my lips, but there it was, calling from the darkness below. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to the nearest window, forced it open, and climbed out onto the narrow overhang. The drop to the ground was rough, bruising my hip and shoulder, but I made it. I grabbed my bike and pedaled like a man possessed, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main forest road, still glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something stalking me. The ride home blurred into hours. My mind raced through rational explanations. Structural noise, an animal, my imagination running wild. But the voice had been real. Impossible, but real. Back at my apartment, I tried to trace the building's history. Nothing. No records of mining operations, logging activity, or structures at those coordinates. No missing person reports from the 70s matched the wall entries. It was as if the place had never existed, or as if someone had wiped it clean from memory. I went back to the forum where I first read about the logging road, hoping to contact the original poster. The post was gone, completely vanished, not just deleted. I searched archives, browser history, every trace. Nothing. I haven't returned to that area. Not once. I don't know if the structure still stands or if the writing is even there. Part of me wonders if it was all in my head, a hallucination fueled by isolation, winter cold, and my own obsession. But the bruises from jumping off the roof, the GPS coordinates, and the blurry photos I snapped of the walls tell a different story. Most terrifying of all is the memory of that voice, the way it perfectly mirrored mine, echoing from the darkness inside that decayed building. Some places in the Appalachian Mountains are older than we can comprehend, holding secrets that shouldn't be disturbed. I've come to accept that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Certain ruins and abandoned trails exist for a reason, tucked away to protect us from what lingers there. I ride the mountains less aggressively now. I stick to marked paths. I ignore rumors of lost logging roads, hidden mines, and forgotten cabins. And if I ever hear the forest go silent in a way that doesn't feel natural, I turn around without question. The experience changed me. It reshaped the way I see solitude, the way I perceive time, and the way I understand fear. I realize now that danger in these woods isn't always obvious. It doesn't roar or charge. Sometimes it watches, waits, and whispers in voices that feel like your own. It's patient. It's cunning. And it's older than any trail or tree. After that December ride, I started researching other reports from Pisgah and surrounding areas. Tales of hikers hearing footsteps when no one was there, of cabins appearing in places that should have no structures, of voices echoing from deep hollows. My story fit a pattern. Other explorers and locals had described similar phenomena, often dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. But I can't dismiss it anymore. I can't ignore what I heard and saw. Months passed, and I tried to bury the memory. But the forest has a way of calling you back. One quiet morning in early spring, I went for a short ride on a familiar trail closer to town. The trees were just beginning to leaf out, and the air was crisp with a hint of frost. For a moment, everything was normal. The sound of tires on gravel, birds calling, sunlight filtering through the branches. Then the forest fell silent. The silence wasn't empty. It felt deliberate, almost sentient. I froze. The hair on my arms and neck stood on end. I didn't move forward. I didn't look for explanations. I turned my bike around and rode back the way I came, heart hammering, lungs burning. That brief moment reminded me how fragile our sense of safety in the woods really is. The mountains themselves are indifferent, but some things that live in their shadow are not. Some things notice. Some things wait. Friends have asked me if I've ever gone back to investigate, to prove to myself that I imagined it, to confront whatever was in that cabin. I tell them no. And it's not cowardice. It's survival. Some doors are closed for a reason. Some places are not meant to be seen. When curiosity conflicts with self-preservation, I've learned which side to choose. Even now, years later, I replay that day in my mind. I see the clearing, the rotten boards, the wall covered in scribbles, the dark patch in the corner. I hear my voice calling from nowhere, impossible yet undeniable. I wonder what that thing was, or if it even had a physical form. Was it an echo of the past? A remnant of some ritual? A predator that mimics its prey? I don't know, and I don't want to know. Some knowledge comes with a cost. Some experiences leave marks on the mind that never fully heal. I keep my GPS coordinates and photos locked away, a silent warning to myself. And when I ride, I stay vigilant, tuned to the rhythms of the forest, to the creaks, snaps, and whispers that hint at things unseen. I've learned to respect the mountains in a new way, not just as terrain to conquer, but as a place full of mysteries and warnings. The forest is alive in ways we can't measure. Shadows move when you aren't looking. Sounds echo from impossible directions. And sometimes, when you think you're alone, something else is there, watching, waiting, patient beyond comprehension. That December afternoon taught me a truth I can't unlearn. Curiosity can be dangerous. Solitude can be treacherous. And some ruins in the Appalachian Mountains are better left untouched. So now I ride cautiously, carefully. I avoid hidden paths. I ignore abandoned cabins. And I trust instincts that once would have seemed paranoid. The forest has rules older than any map or guide, and it communicates in ways humans barely understand. Those who venture too far off the beaten path may encounter things that defy logic, things that mimic us, watch us, and manipulate the shadows. I've accepted that I'll never fully explain that day. I'll never know if the cabin and its walls of desperate scribbles were a glimpse into another reality, a malevolent presence, or something else entirely. I've come to understand that some encounters are warnings, meant to teach without explanation. I will never forget that voice, the way it sounded like me but carried an intent that wasn't mine. And I will never again take the forest's silence for granted. There are places in those hills where reality frays, where history refuses to stay buried, and where the reckless curiosity of humans can invite danger they cannot comprehend. I still ride, but I do so cautiously, respectfully. I watch the forest with new eyes and ears, and I heed the unspoken warning that some calls are not meant to be answered. Some roads should remain forgotten, and some cabins should remain sealed, their secrets left to the shadows that dwell within. Because in the Appalachian Mountains, the past is never really gone. And some mysteries are too old, too hungry, and too patient to ever let you leave unchanged. Story 8. Before anyone jumps to conclusions, Sophia wanted to make one thing clear. She had no idea what she was stepping into when she decided to cover the abandoned homesteads scattered across the Appalachian backcountry. A freelance journalist with a steady string of human interest and history features for regional magazines, she had always loved telling stories about forgotten corners of her state. The idea came from a casual chat with an editor who casually mentioned the hundreds of deserted farms that dotted the mountains, places people had left behind during the mass migration out of Appalachia in the mid-20th century. Sophia immediately saw the potential for a photo essay. Abandoned cabins, rusting farm implements, and overgrown fields. Silent witnesses to lives that had vanished. Appalachian Life magazine agreed to the piece, giving her a modest stipend for travel and photography. She spent the next 2 weeks digging into maps, county land records, and historical society files, also talking to older residents who could recall when these homesteads were still occupied. One name kept surfacing: the Pritchard homestead, tucked away in a hollow deep in the western Virginia mountains, roughly 12 miles from Grundy. The place had been abandoned abruptly in 1964, and nobody seemed to know exactly why. The Pritchards, William and Martha, along with their 3 kids, had vanished overnight. Neighbors who checked on the family found the house empty, yet otherwise untouched, as though the family had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Sophia was fascinated. This wasn't just another abandoned cabin, it was a genuine mystery. She contacted the current owner, a distant relative living in North Carolina who had never even set foot on the property. He granted her permission to explore, offering only a vague warning. The hollow had a reputation, though he didn't elaborate. Sophia enlisted Vernon Deal, a local hunting guide in his late 60s. Taciturn, wary of outsiders, but familiar with every nook and cranny of the surrounding mountains, Vernon reluctantly agreed to lead her for a fee. On a crisp November morning, they drove as far as logging roads allowed, then hiked the final 5 miles on foot. The trail was overgrown, faint from decades of neglect. Vernon moved confidently, pointing out landmarks and telling brief stories about the area. He warned that hunters avoided the hollow, game was sparse, and the place carried a sense of wrongness. When Sophia pressed him for details, he only shrugged, muttering that some hollows just weren't right, that darkness seemed to settle like water in certain parts of the mountains. By mid-afternoon, they reached the Pritchard clearing. Saplings and briars had begun reclaiming the land, but the house itself, a two-story log structure with a stone chimney, was mostly intact. Windows were shattered, the porch sagging dangerously, but the skeleton of the home was sound. Sophia felt a shiver as she approached, a nod of instinctive unease she attributed to isolation and history. Vernon stayed back, smoking a cigarette, scanning the tree line. Sophia stepped inside cautiously, testing each floorboard before putting her weight down, her camera ready. The interior was astonishing, frozen mid-routine, as if the family had vanished moments ago. Dishes remained on the kitchen table, clothing still hung in bedrooms, and children's toys lay scattered across the floor. The air carried a heavy sense of absence, a silent grief. She photographed systematically, documenting every detail. In the main bedroom, she found journals and photo albums, delicate but legible. Martha's entries began in the 1950s, ordinary accounts of farm life, children growing, seasons changing. By 1962, the tone darkened. Martha wrote about strange nighttime noises, the feeling of being watched outside, animals behaving oddly, refusing to cross certain areas. William dismissed her concerns, calling them mountain superstitions, but her entries grew increasingly anxious. By early 1964, her handwriting became frantic. She wrote about seeing figures in the trees, shapes that moved like humans but weren't quite right. Symbols appeared carved into surrounding trees, ancient and menacing. Martha begged William to leave, but he refused, tied to the farm they had built over generations. The last entry, dated April 15, 1964, simply stated that they were leaving. She did not explain why. The page ended mid-thought, leaving an abrupt, chilling silence. Sophia's heart raced as she read. She packed the journal carefully, continuing her photo survey. In the attic, she discovered loose photographs scattered near an old trunk. Most depicted everyday farm life, yet a few were unsettling. The forest around the homestead contained pale, elongated figures among the trees, almost human, but distorted. Sophia scrutinized them, considering film degradation or long exposure, but the figures seemed intentional, positioned deliberately as if observing the home. By late afternoon, the light began to wane. She called to Vernon, who appeared in the doorway with a grim expression. He urged them to leave immediately, sensing danger. He spoke of a familiar feeling he sometimes got in the woods, the sense of being hunted rather than the hunter. Sophia hesitated, torn between capturing more images and heeding his warning, but Vernon's fear was unmistakable. They departed, pushing through the thick undergrowth as dusk fell, Vernon keeping a watchful eye over his shoulder and hand on his rifle. On the hike back, he mentioned finding fresh tracks near the homestead, human-sized but with an unusual gait. Someone had circled the property while they explored, unseen yet present. By the time they reached his truck, darkness had fully fallen. Sophia was scratched, weary, and unsettled by the genuine fear in Vernon's eyes. Later, back in her motel room, she reviewed her photos. Most were as expected, documentation of the homestead, frozen in decay. But in several images, figures appeared at the clearing's edge, pale and elongated, watching the house. They had not been visible to her, but the camera had captured them, unmistakably deliberate in their placement. Sophia spent the next week researching the hollow more deeply. Records showed the Pritchards were not the first family to vanish there. In 1871, the Morrison family left under mysterious circumstances. In 1928, the Blakes disappeared entirely. Over a century, families moved in, lived for years, and then either fled or vanished. Hikers and hunters went missing too, at least 20 in total, never found despite exhaustive searches. Her article became far darker than she had envisioned, weaving Martha Pritchard's journal and unsettling photographs into a broader narrative of disappearances stretching across generations. Appalachian life rejected it, citing its grim focus. Undeterred, Sophia self-published online. The story went viral, drawing attention from paranormal investigators and skeptics alike. Vernon cut ties. Furious, she exposed the hollow, while the distant owner threatened legal action, though nothing came of it. Sophia herself began having nightmares, standing in the homestead as pale shapes circled outside, inching closer each night. She never returned, but the journals and photographs remained with her, a haunting reminder of the hollow and the darkness lurking in forgotten corners of Appalachia. After the first wave of research and photography, Sophia couldn't shake the images of the Pritchard homestead from her mind. The more she studied the journal and photographs, the more she realized the hollow was not just eerie, it seemed cursed. Over the next few days, she dug into local archives and county records, uncovering stories that were buried beneath decades of folklore. Families who had lived there often disappeared without explanation. Sometimes it was sudden, like the Pritchards. Other times, it was a slow unraveling. Neighbors reporting strange behavior, sleepless nights, and an ever-growing dread that drove them to abandon their homes. She found mention of the Morrison family from 1871. They had moved into the hollow, worked the land for years, and then vanished one autumn. Their belongings were left behind, neat and orderly, almost as if they had stepped out for a brief errand. Then there were the Blakes in 1928. That case was even stranger. No one had ever seen them again, and even searching parties reported odd sensations, whispers of movement in the woods, and glimpses of figures just beyond the tree line. In the early 1900s, the area had been avoided by travelers. Some maps even labeled it the Hollow of Shadows, a term Sophia initially assumed was poetic exaggeration, until she pieced together the pattern. Sophia discovered that over the past century, hunters, hikers, and even surveyors had gone missing in and around the hollow. Search parties combed the area multiple times, but the forest seemed to swallow them whole. Witnesses claimed to see shapes moving at the edge of visibility, and sometimes animals avoided the area entirely. These accounts were sporadic and anecdotal, but when combined with the historical record, they formed a disturbing continuity, a location that defied explanation, where human habitation often ended in disappearance. She returned to her motel room each evening exhausted, reviewing photographs and transcribing journal entries. The images of elongated, pale figures in the trees continued to haunt her. They were always at the periphery of the frame, standing silently, observing. She began comparing them to the positions of shadows cast by the sun that afternoon, checking angles and light exposure. Every detail suggested these shapes were not photographic artifacts. They were intentionally present. One night, Sophia received a message from a distant relative of the Pritchards, someone who had never visited the hollow but had inherited other properties nearby. They mentioned hearing local legends of the hollow's watchers, entities that allegedly followed the comings and goings of anyone entering the territory. Sophia had initially dismissed it as folklore, but the more evidence she gathered, the less dismissible it became. The combination of journals, photographs, and historical records painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Something actively interfered with people in that hollow, sometimes driving them away, sometimes erasing them entirely. Her research also led her to old survey maps showing anomalies. Certain areas had never been fully mapped, and some land plots overlapped confusingly. Oral histories spoke of trees carved with symbols that did not match any known language or tribal markings. These glyphs, sometimes circular, sometimes jagged, were consistently associated with missing families and travelers. When she cross-referenced locations of disappearances, a clear pattern emerged. The incidents were clustered within a small, roughly circular area at the heart of the hollow, suggesting a specific zone of influence. Sophia's fascination was tempered by a growing sense of danger. On 2 occasions, she felt she was being watched near the motel, catching glimpses of shadows moving between buildings. She chalked it up to nerves, but her instincts were hard to ignore. The hollow itself seemed to extend beyond physical space. It left an impression, a sense of unease that lingered even miles away. One evening, she attempted to photograph the area surrounding the hollow from a ridge she had spotted on an old topographic map. Using a telephoto lens, she scanned the forest. The images revealed pale, humanoid figures standing along ridgelines and in tree gaps, always just far enough away to avoid direct attention, but positioned as if observing. There was no mistaking their posture. They were watching. Sophia's pulse quickened, and she realized the hollow's darkness was active, perhaps aware of her presence. Determined to contextualize the phenomenon, she delved into regional folklore and Native American oral histories. Some elders spoke of places where the world thins, areas where spirits or guardians lived, places humans were not meant to inhabit. They warned that entering such spaces could bring misfortune, illness, or disappearance. Sophia noted that many of these locations matched the areas where families had vanished. She also learned that settlers who tried to farm in those hollows often reported unnerving sounds at night, livestock behaving strangely, and a constant sense of being observed. After weeks of compiling her findings, Sophia realized she was writing something far darker than the original photo essay. It was not just a story of forgotten homes. It was an investigation into a century-long pattern of human disappearance, linked to a specific location and supported by journals, photographs, maps, and oral histories. She transcribed Martha Pritchard's journal in full, carefully annotating each mention of fear, shadow figures, and unexplained phenomena. Sophia submitted the story to Appalachian Life magazine, but they rejected it. Her reporting was too dark, too unsettling, too concerned with supernatural implications rather than cultural preservation. Undeterred, she published it independently online. The article spread quickly, attracting paranormal investigators, folklorists, and amateur sleuths. Some dismissed her findings as fantasy. Others were convinced the hollow's history confirmed long-held regional legends. After publication, Vernon cut off contact, angry that she had revealed the location despite his repeated warnings. The distant Pritchard descendant threatened legal action, though nothing materialized. Sophia began experiencing vivid nightmares, standing inside the abandoned homestead while pale figures slowly circled outside, inching closer with each dream. Each morning, she awoke in a cold sweat. The images of the hollow burned into her mind. Despite the growing anxiety, she kept the photographs and the journal as proof, physical evidence of what she had witnessed. She never returned to the hollow, never attempted further fieldwork. But the images and records remained, haunting reminders of what lies beyond human understanding in the Appalachian Mountains, ancient, patient, and waiting for the next family, the next curious explorer, to trespass into the territory humans abandoned long ago for reasons that time and memory only partially explain. Story 9. Back in 2019, Alexander still gets chills just thinking about it. He and 2 buddies from college had decided to spend spring break poking around abandoned coal camps in southern West Virginia. All 3 were juniors at Marshall State University, majoring in history and photography. The lure of the decaying remnants of the coal industry, ghost towns left behind when the mines shut down, was irresistible. Alexander, a Charleston native, had grown up hearing about the coal towns tucked away in the hollows around his hometown. He'd always been drawn to them, imagining what life might have been like when the towns thrived. Marcus and Tyler, his friends and fellow explorers, shared that fascination. Together, They'd spent months studying old mining maps, property records, and company archives to pinpoint camps that were accessible and, hopefully, not deadly. Safety was always a concern. After all, these buildings had been abandoned for decades. The camp they picked for that March weekend was called Black Hollow, a ghost town about 40 miles south of Charleston, tucked deep in a forested valley. Back in the 1930s and 40s, it had been a buzzing mining community of over 300 people. The mine collapsed in 1954, killing 18 men, and the company walked away, leaving the town to rot. Within a year, the residents had moved on, and by 1960, the town was completely deserted. They drove as far as the rutted access road allowed, then hiked the last 3 miles into the hollow. The path was rough, washed out by decades of storms, roots, and mud. By early afternoon, they emerged into the clearing that had once been Black Hollow. Dozens of buildings still stood, though most leaned at odd angles or had partially caved in. The old company houses, a small church with its steeple still intact, a school, and the general store. Everything was there, but all coated with decay. The trio split up, agreeing to meet back at the camp entrance in 2 hours. Alexander headed for the superintendent's house, a slightly larger building perched on a rise overlooking the rest of the town. Surprisingly intact, its roof mostly held together, walls still square, it seemed as though the superintendent had just stepped out. Alexander carefully tested the porch boards and pushed open the door. The interior smelled of rot and wildlife. His flashlight revealed furnishings that seemed frozen in time. A couch and chairs were in the front room, a dining table set with plates, and upstairs, bedrooms still had clothes hanging in closets. The sense of abandonment was eerie, almost like a snapshot of a life interrupted. He was photographing a child's room, toys scattered on the floor, when he heard footsteps below. Slow, deliberate, moving through the first floor. He assumed Marcus or Tyler had joined him and called out, but no one answered. The footsteps moved room to room. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He called louder. The footsteps stopped. Only the house settling answered him. Alexander descended cautiously, flashlight slicing through shadows. Every room was empty. He stepped outside, brushing off the unease, and continued exploring the other structures. The general store had rusted cans on the shelves. The school still held desks in neat rows. But in a small house at the far end of the camp, he noticed something deeply unsettling. Signs of recent use. A sleeping bag lay on the floor, not coated with the dust that blanketed everything else. Empty food wrappers, a water bottle, a small camping stove. Someone had been living here, or at least staying regularly. The hair on the back of his neck rose. He left immediately and headed toward the meeting point, wanting to warn his friends. As he moved through the camp's center, other clues emerged. A tarp strung between buildings for shelter, fresh footprints in the dirt, and clothing hanging on a line between 2 trees. Women's clothing, multiple sizes, all in good condition, far too much for a single person, suggesting multiple individuals. Alexander broke into a run, shouting for his friends. He found Tyler near the old church, already aware of the signs. Marcus was by the general store, snapping photos. Alexander explained what he'd seen. They agreed to get out immediately. This was more than a squatter. It felt organized, deliberate, and the clothing sent a sick chill through him. As they moved toward the camp entrance, a man appeared. Tall, thin, bearded, wearing dirty jeans and a flannel shirt. He simply stood in the path, blocking their way. Alexander decided to skirt him, moving off trail into the forest. Minutes later, another man appeared, stockier and shorter, also silent. Panic surged. They were being corralled. More figures emerged from the buildings, surrounding them. Tyler suggested fighting, but Alexander saw they were outnumbered and in unfamiliar territory. Survival meant running. They plunged into the forest, bushwhacking, navigating by instinct and map memory. Behind them, branches snapped as the men pursued. Alexander led the way uphill, hoping to reach a ridgeline that could provide orientation. Marcus lagged, struggling on the steep incline. Tyler and Alexander slowed to help, but the sounds of pursuit drew nearer. They reached a small clearing and paused. That's when they heard Marcus scream. A few yards back, he had stumbled. Tyler moved to help, but Alexander gripped his arm. They could not risk getting caught. Pressing on, they finally hit the ridge as dusk fell, then followed it toward a road, using Alexander's phone GPS. Hours later, after midnight, they flagged down a truck on a paved highway and were taken to town. The county sheriff's office launched a full search the next morning. Deputies and state troopers combed the camp, finding reinforced structures, weatherproofed buildings, and evidence of criminal activity. Drug paraphernalia, a meth lab, bloodstains, and more women's clothing, some damaged. In the old mine entrance, partially reopened, lay human remains. 3 bodies, 2 women and a man, decomposed beyond identification. Marcus's body was later discovered about a quarter-mile from where Alexander last saw him, a fatal head injury inflicted during their escape. The abandoned town had been a hub of criminal enterprise, drugs, possible human trafficking, and violence. Authorities believed at least 5 men had operated from the camp, all gone when law enforcement arrived. Surveillance from a distant gas station showed men in a pickup truck on the day of the incident, but they remained unidentified. After that night, Alexander's life changed forever. The shock of what happened in Black Hollow haunted him daily. He left Marshall State University at the semester's end, unable to concentrate on classes. He kept replaying the forest chase, the terror of being surrounded, and, most painfully, leaving Marcus behind. Rationally, he knew there had been no choice, but the guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He relocated to Ohio, switched majors, and tried to carve out a normal life. Yet the memory of Black Hollow lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. Tyler managed to finish his degree, but the experience left deep scars. He suffered from severe anxiety and PTSD, plagued by flashbacks of that night. The 2 friends rarely spoke now. When they did, it was never about Black Hollow. Talking about it brought too much pain and fear to the surface. They shared a bond, yes, but one woven with trauma and loss, silent and fragile. The abandoned coal camps of southern West Virginia, Alexander realized, were more than historical relics. Dozens remained scattered through the mountains, slowly succumbing to nature. Some had been restored for tourism or preserved as reminders of the region's industrial past. But many, like Black Hollow, were unreachable, tucked into hollows where the roads no longer existed, isolated and forgotten. Those remote settlements offered sanctuary to things that could not withstand the light of day, places where dark deeds could take root and vanish unnoticed. Alexander knew Black Hollow was not unique. He had read accounts of similar ghost towns where disappearances occurred, or where abandoned structures had become safe havens for criminal activity. The mountains, dense and labyrinthine, were perfect for those who knew them, while outsiders were at the mercy of the terrain. People could vanish there without a trace, lost to woods, history, or worse. He often thought of Marcus, the friend who hadn't made it out alive. That day replayed endlessly in his mind. The frantic dash through dense undergrowth, the sound of Marcus screaming, the crushing realization that there was nothing they could do. Marcus became a symbol of all those who had vanished in the hollows over the decades. Miners, families, explorers, hikers. names lost to the forests and time. Alexander tried therapy, medication, and meditation, but nothing erased the constant background hum of fear and regret. He stopped urban exploring altogether, never returning to abandoned buildings or remote hollows. Even on hikes through familiar terrain, he felt the unease, a prickling sensation that something was watching from the shadows, waiting for mistakes, waiting for people to wander where they didn't belong. Tyler, though finishing his degree, also carried the weight of Black Hollow with him. He avoided solitary adventures, avoided rural areas, and had trouble trusting the unknown. Both men, scarred by a single weekend, lived cautiously, their experiences shaping daily routines in subtle but profound ways. They rarely spoke about it, because words failed to capture the terror, and silence had become their mutual protection. The investigation into Black Hollow revealed layers of criminal activity that shocked local authorities. The abandoned town had been a base for years, not just for drug production, but also for more sinister operations. The women's clothing, some shredded or damaged, hinted at the possibility of human trafficking or abuse. The mine entrance held human remains, unidentified, unclaimed. Investigators believed at least 5 men had used the site as a hub. When the law arrived, the perpetrators had vanished into the mountains, disappearing as seamlessly as the town's original residents decades earlier. Despite arrests made later based on evidence recovered at the camp, the principal operators were never caught. Surveillance footage from a gas station 40 miles away showed a pickup truck with masked individuals, license plate obscured. Authorities never identified them. The case remains open. Marcus's murder, a grim echo of that night, is unsolved. Alexander and Tyler's friendship, once solid, was now defined by mutual trauma. Rare phone calls skirted around the past. Letters or messages never mentioned Black Hollow. They both carried scars invisible to the world, but impossible to ignore internally. Each time Alexander hears about abandoned towns in the news, or reads an article about explorers disappearing in Appalachia, a knot tightens in his stomach. He knows the forest holds secrets no one should stumble into. Over the years, Alexander researched abandoned coal camps quietly, reading historical documents, news articles, and local accounts. He discovered patterns, settlements that had been abandoned after mine closures, where families vanished or strange incidents occurred. It was a harsh lesson. Not all ghost towns were inert. Some concealed active dangers. Nature had reclaimed the land, yes, but people, or what remained of them, sometimes did too. In quieter moments, Alexander reflected on the region itself. Appalachia, with its winding hollows and mist-covered ridges, had long been a haven for isolation. During the mining boom, these remote settlements had been thriving communities. Now, with the mines gone and nature creeping back, those same places were both alluring and dangerous. Beauty and terror lived side by side, and Alexander had seen the latter up close. He thought often about the countless others who had vanished without notice. Coal camps abandoned in haste, families leaving behind their homes, explorers misjudging the wilderness. Black Hollow was one story in a long history of disappearances, yet it was the one that had marked him irrevocably. He sometimes imagined other explorers walking into similar traps, unprepared for the shadows that thrived there, unready for the violence or human cruelty that lingered long after the mines went silent. For Alexander, the mountains would always hold a memory of that spring break, the exhilaration of discovery, the haunting beauty of abandoned structures, and the raw, unforgettable terror of being hunted. He never returned to those hollows, never again sought the thrill of abandoned buildings. The mountains, beautiful and wild, had claimed a piece of him that no education, therapy, or new life could restore. In the end, the story of Black Hollow is both cautionary and tragic. It serves as a reminder that history is not only found in books or museums. Sometimes it lurks in the shadows of abandoned places, in the hollows and forgotten roads, where the past collides with the present in deadly ways. Alexander knows that beyond the tourist-friendly ghost towns and preserved mining villages, there are countless hollows still hiding secrets, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far, and perhaps never return. Marcus's name joins the long list of those lost to the Appalachian wilderness. Ordinary people, explorers, adventurers, who ventured into places humans abandoned for a reason. And Alexander, carrying his guilt and memory, lives with the knowledge that the mountains are patient, ancient, and merciless to those who underestimate them.